Well, welcome everybody. This is kind of a recorded version of Change Chat, and I am very glad today to welcome Matt Gimmel to the Organizing for Change channel. Matt and I kind of connected. I started watching his videos. I love to write, but we kind of seem to come at the Supernote a couple of different ways, and we wanted to have a conversation back and forth between the two of us, and maybe speak to some of you all in our respective audiences as to maybe different ways of using not just the Supernote. I mean, I think we can have a broader conversation, but the idea of using digital tools and maybe doing things a little bit differently and looking at it from a writer's perspective, which I'll let Matt introduce himself here and tell you a lot more about what he does. And then from my perspective, which is very much, there's creativity involved because I teach, but there's also a lot of organization, a lot of making sure you're managing projects and doing different things of that sort. So I think those two lenses kind of lead themselves into a good conversation. So welcome, Matt. If you wouldn't mind, I'm not sure everybody on my channel is familiar with you yet. I've mentioned you a few times in some different comments, but I'd like to get them to know you a little bit.
Thank you. I really appreciate the invitation. It's wonderful to be here speaking to you. My name is Matt Gemmell. As you'll probably have noticed, I'm Scottish. Speaking to you from surprisingly sunny Edinburgh this afternoon. My background is in technology. I used to be a software engineer, and that's where my qualifications are. I did that for a long time, but in recent years and for a number of years now, I've made a dramatic change, and now I write novels for a living. So crossing over from the sciences to the arts side of things.
Yeah, thank you. And that kind of leads me to the first question because just so the audience knows, Matt and I did do some prep. We're probably going to jump into some other things as we go, but there are some questions that we had in advance. Kind of for both of us, I'm curious, Matt, what was like your aha moment? What was the thing that you were maybe, I mean, you were in software engineering, so you were comfortable with technology, but what was the thing that you were using pen and paper, or you were maybe beginning your writing process, whatever the reasons were, that made you think about going digital for that aspect of what you did, specifically ink?
E-ink was not the entry point for me. The entry point was the iPad with the Apple Pencil. In I suppose, a fit of minimalism and focus and an attempt at some kind of efficiency, I switched to the iPad as my full-time computer about 8.5 years ago and used it for absolutely everything, which is something that you can do when you're out of software engineering and into writing and things like that. And mostly I used it as a writing tool in the typing on a keyboard sense, but I increasingly found that what I liked most about the device was the sort of chameleonic and transformational aspect, where it can become whatever, it can turn into whatever app you're using. Basically, it can become a sketching book or a diary or whatever else. And I found that my most productive planning sessions by far were those that were done not on physical paper, but in a pen and paper type of interface on the iPad, and apps like GoodNotes initially, and then Notability. Of course, the markup drawing interface that's vended by the iPad OS system into various apps that use it. It was just the ability to get away from the feeling of being locked into the desk and sitting in front of a computer keyboard. It just felt like it unlocked something, and not something new, something very old. I wrote fiction when I was a teenager for years, and of course it was always pen and paper back then. Computers most certainly existed, and I did have one, but I did like drafting long form and using diaries and all that kind of thing. And I just found that a certain tension was released when using a pen, even if it was the Apple Pencil on that shiny glass screen. So I was very much having that dual mode thing, where I would be sitting writing and maybe editing with the iPad as a more of a computer type thing with a keyboard, but the majority of the planning happened in that pen and paper mode. Years went by, and it was actually mostly my wife that was responsible for this, but inadvertently. She's a huge reader, one of these people who does a yearly challenge to read so many dozens of books in the course of the calendar year, and obsessively keeps track of it, the way some people keep track of the rings on their fitness watch for every day. She was pretty much needing a new Kindle, and Amazon had just released the Scribe, and I knew that at work she kept 2 different paper notebooks for, I think it was the sort of notes or minutes from the meeting, and one for tasks that had come out of it. And when I saw that, the release of the Scribe, it just so happened to be a month or so before her birthday, so the planets had aligned, and I thought, oh, this could be a good gift. Sure enough, I got her that, and she was delighted with it, and it has become the device that she carries about and takes to work all the time. And when she's working from home, and me, she'll be using the Scribe and the Scribe pen to take these notes longhand. And I did what I think an awful lot of tech gift-giving husbands do, in that she received it and she started using it and she loved it so much, and I felt so damn jealous that I then immediately bought myself one as well. So that was my first entry into e-ink tablets. And then I did the other thing that people, particularly of a technical background, do, in that you get one thing and then you start thinking, well, I wonder what else is out there and how I can upgrade this thing. So I started looking around, and that was the first time that I really became consciously aware of anything other than the Remarkable series. And the only reason I was aware of Remarkable at all, of course, was because of the ubiquitous advertising that you cannot avoid. I didn't get one, but I did get a books device. I think it was the Note Air 3, the black and white version of the Note Air, the 3 line, not the colour one. And I liked it enough. There are certain, for me, in terms of focus, weaknesses to devices that are more tablet type and feature heavy. For me, the primary purpose of something that is paper-like is to stay as close to the simplicity, the elementality, and that sort of single task at a time, single focus at a time style of working, just with some digital enhancements and conveniences. I think I then got with the 10.3, Books Go 10.3, and that was an aesthetic decision just because it was such a beautiful thing, and it had the bezel that practically matched the screen color, such that it made the screen disappear in a Remarkable 2 sort of way, and beautiful in the hand and very light, but still fundamentally the same interface. I had been aware by this point, of course, for quite some time of Supernote and of its quite different and unique approach to the interface, whereby you're always in a document and there's no home screen, and every other piece of interface is transient and you're really focusing on the work. And of course the gestures, the way you can undo and redo and refresh and pull a sidebar, you can lasso delete and lasso select, all without having any interface visible whatsoever. It just sort of pushed me to think perhaps I should try this. And it was actually mostly the availability of the smaller form factor of the Nomad that caused me to finally make that jump. And once I did, I thought, what am I doing with these other devices? This is exactly what I need, mostly from the point of view of the workflow and the interface design rather than the size. But the size was just so incredibly convenient for so many of the everyday ways that I use an e-ink tablet. And of course it went from there. And now, as you know, I have Manta here as well.
Yeah,
and I really don't see myself ever going back.
I'm really curious. I want to pull on a couple of threads there, because prior to the work I do now in academia and some of the things that I've done like at a different operational level, I started in customer service years ago as a kid. So I was very much used to those one-to-one interactions where you would talk to someone and have a real conversation about whatever was happening with them. And I kind of was a tech junkie. I grew up in the age of the internet coming to be. So I mean, I was ICQ chat back in the day and all of these things that were
I
very,
remember ICQ.
and so I had these things, and I use digital tools all the time. But one thing, and fast forward a bunch of years after I was playing with computers and doing a lot of things digitally, one thing I found is when I was in academics and I was in meetings, I was pulling my laptop out and it created a barrier between me and the person that I was trying to have a conversation with. So I actually reverted and started carrying around, and I don't have it with me, but a full legal side notepad. And I would have it in a nice leather folio, I guess you would call it. And I would take that with me on the road. And unless I had to show something with my computer, I was using that and I was taking notes. And then I would come back and I would transcribe those into OneNote, which leads me to something though that I think there was a good component to that. And I'll talk about that a little later, but it allowed me to keep that one-on-one connection with the person. The technology wasn't getting in the way.
And the fluency and the immediacy of the paper.
Absolutely. I mean, it was an immediate feedback. I was only taking notes on things I needed. I didn't have any distraction. I wasn't tempted to look at an email pop up or a notification pop up because we were just having a conversation. And when e-ink came around, initially it was e-readers and I wanted them to be e-notepads. And I was studying in my master's and my doctoral program, and I was trying to find something to do what Supernote now does and Books now does, and even the Kindle Scribe to a large extent does, and none of it worked. So I was like, okay, paper's my thing, and then transcribe over and do it digitally and write that way. And it was never the best flow for me. Even for organizing, I like to mind map. I like to do different things that require you to be more freeform. There are programs that'll do all of these things. I mean, from an IT background, you probably know that. There are mind mapping programs which are effective, but they're not as organic. And so for me,
I've used many of them, and they don't have the interaction smoothness of paper. They sort of trade geometric perfection and aesthetic beauty for the complete release and stress of being able to work something out in a completely freeform way. And I've never found one that could quite bridge the gap. MindNode was close, but still too sort of mechanical. I found myself in the same position as you when I was a consultant engineer for user interface design, particularly for years. That is obviously something that is intensely computer focused, and it's also visual, but it would be paper notebooks that I would take along to these meetings with clients, and I'd be sketching things and physically writing down notes to transcribe in later, just like yourself.
I think the part that's interesting about that is I didn't know quite what I was missing until it was actually during the COVID pandemic, and we were in the public library that I was working at, and we were doing all kinds of different things. One of our IT contractors was in, and I was over that umbrella, and he had a remark in the back room, and he's taking these notes, and I walked back there by our one server that we had, and I said, "What is that? That's really cool." And he said, "Oh, it's called the Remarkable," and he let me doodle on it, let me write on it. I was like, "Man, this is really really neat." And so I did like you said. I not the jealous part, because my wife is not a huge techie. She's more pen and paper, which is kind of funny in our relationship. I went back and I immediately started watching everything. I watched Kit Betts Masters. I watched Voya. Just anybody I could get my hands on, and just watching everything. And instead of going with the Remarkable, which was the first thing I ever tried for a hot 5 minutes, I went to the Supernote. And all of a sudden, it was, when people use the word game changer, a lot of that for hype, you think, but it really was. It was life altering for me, because I no longer needed my folio, which I had been carrying now for well over a decade, if not almost 2 decades, to do different things. I had one device that I could keep notes on, and that's all I really wanted to begin with. So it did everything I wanted. I didn't need it to do any of the cool stuff it now does that they've kind of added over the years, which includes the linking and all of the different components that are so popular. I didn't need that at the time. I just needed something that I could find my notes without digging through 7 or 8 or 20 legal papers.
I think the thing about the Supernote is that it's one of these devices that fall into a very small category in the industry, where they have given themselves permission to sort of start from first principles again in terms of the design. They've not felt we have to come at this from a computer perspective because its physical nature is that of a computer. We are allowed to redesign this, and we are allowed to make no assumptions and come at it from the basis of what is actually best for the workflows we envision for it. And some companies are very good at doing that, and it's integrated into their culture. And a great many companies, unfortunately, are not, and they instead tend to just react and iterate and go with what is safe. You can certainly have disastrous failures in design if you try to innovate in the wrong direction or for innovation's sake. But if you are willing to begin from those first principles and think, what is wrong with what we have? What previous assumptions have people or competitors made that just don't hold for the sort of people that want to use this or for the tasks we want people to use this for? Then you can get these really interesting sort of new ways to simplify and to really home in on the way that people would be better served by devices. And I think the Supernote is absolutely one of those, probably one of the most personally impactful of recent years for me. I read, because I had other devices, competing devices, I read the entire Supernote manual and help pages before having a device and sort of absorbed the ethos slowly and descriptively without having a device to play with in front of me. So I got the chance to sort of understand it and think, I see why you've done that, and I see why you haven't done this, and why it works that way. I think the overall feeling I felt was how funny it is that it's taken so many decades and so much technology in order to get computers back to being paper, but in a way that really allows you to have the benefits of paper and the focus of paper.
Yeah, and you pull on a thread there, and this is something that when I watched one of your recent videos and you were talking about your book Changer, which I'm very interested in the premise, by the way, that listening to you describe the thought process behind it and how you develop stories was really intriguing to me, and how you use characteristics of yourself and people you know. So it was really cool. But one thing I really enjoyed watching, and that I don't use the Supernote as much for, but I think that e-ink in general allows this kind of creativity. I'd argue, like you would, I think that the Supernote does it better. This idea of a jumping off point, or almost a second brain type organic growth piece. I use Obsidian for that. So there is a point where my interconnectivity piece, my mind mapping, jumps out into another thing. And I use that to kind of connect all of the different domains of different projects or whatever it is I might have going on. But at that basic level, as I'm writing something in my e-ink tablet, I may have a link that takes me to a Google Doc for reference that I can pop up in the built-in browser. Or I may have a link that I know there's a note that I need for that meeting. Or I may put it in the quick access, or I may put it over here or there, especially when I'm doing this social media type work, which is a hobby for me, but something I'm really interested in, and I'm writing a blog. I use it very organically, like you kind of did in that way. And I'll try and find a link to that, folks, and link this video for Matt when we post this so that you can see what I'm talking about. I just think that's really cool, this idea of having something that's both old school, for lack of a better term, but very much writing and being in the moment and doing something very focused, but still allows you to branch out. I can't think about this right now anymore. I need to move over here.
I think you're right. I think it's at the edges of use that we find where enhancements can be made. I think that's a sort of a fundamental truth. The killer feature of paper for me is it's the tactility and the physicality and the unhurried pace, and the fact that you can put down anything you want, be it words or a mind map, if you like, a diagram, whatever it might be, a sketch. The problems with paper lie at the figurative edges of use, where you cannot readily or cleanly erase, and there are physical limitations to how much you can fit. The burden of carrying it scales linearly with the number of sheets and all this kind of thing. And those edges are where there is opportunity for enhancement. Also, linking to things and organizing, as you said, those are such edges as well. And the reason the Supernote just works so incredibly well for how I feel about planning and thinking and working is that it gives me pretty much all of what I love about paper, and its enhancements are at those edges. The fact that you can erase and you can move around, you can add as many virtual pages, you can shuffle the virtual pages, you can search if you might need to, you can link out to other things. There's a degree of organization, but all of those things just sit quietly behind the scenes and give you the interface of a piece of paper and a writing tool, so that you can have that, just that freeform openness, that potential for creativity, not having the light of a screen beaming into your eyes and a menu bar and icons and notifications and docs and sounds and all that stuff. You've just got paper and everything is quiet and calm, but you still have these little digital extras, these niceties, these conveniences, editability and sync and all that stuff, but not in a way that define the interface of the thing. And it's a really special combination.
I agree. And I think, you had mentioned it earlier, and, I don't want this, and I don't think it has been, but to be all about the Supernote. But of course, you and I are both fans of the platform. You mentioned earlier, being able to kind of their design philosophy. You read through the manual and made sure, kind of what they were up to. I think one of the coolest things about their design philosophy, at least from my perspective, is that unlike what I perceive as remarkable in books, because I've not owned either of those platforms, they kind of tell you what you need to do. I mean, books is a little bit more Wild West because you can do a lot of different things, but within their note-taking app, they're very much structured. Remarkable is like, here's what our thing is, and this is how you have to use it, and they're more prescriptive. Supernote's kind of like, hey, use this thing however you want. If you want to hide the toolbar, it's real easy, double tap. If you want to hide the page count, hey, tap down here at the bottom. If you want to use gestures, go ahead. If you don't, here's this. And it to me, it just feels like they get the technology, to your point, and I think mine earlier, out of your way. It's like if you don't
Yeah,
want
yeah.
to see anything but the canvas, that's all you see. But if you want something else, it's there, but it's not aggressive.
I think what you've made me think of there is one of the things that I thought when I actually got my first Supernote, the Nomad in my case. They give you functionality without defining how you should use it. And that's the thing, whereas other manufacturers very commonly have such a completely preconceived and for that reason narrower idea of a piece of functionality. The implementation is very specific, such that you can use it properly, intentionally in a single way. Whereas what I find with the whole design of the Supernote and its interface is that they give you abilities to do that you could use for doing multiple things, and they don't tell you which one or which ones that you have to use it for. So things like the headings, they pull an entry into a table of contents, but you can use that for whatever purpose you might like, whether it's a table of contents or whether it's reference. They give you the auto-recognize star gesture thing, and you can use that as a bookmark, or you can use it pretty much like be it a universal keyword. You can use it as a to-do, here's something I need to come back to, or an action item out of a set of meeting notes. And I think that's just generally true. Even the sidebar menu with the quick access list, what that actually semantically means for you is entirely up to you and how you use the device. So they give you these beautiful sort of outlines of a piece of functionality, but they leave the implementation of it in your workflow entirely up to yourself. And what that reminded me of immediately upon getting my Nomad and starting to use it is the various journaling systems that have been created for paper notebooks, like bullet journaling and so on, where they give you just a framework and leave the implementation largely up to you. You know, you can decide how to carry things forward, or whether you create weekly pages as well as daily pages, or whatever applies to the system. And there are hundreds out there. And the reason they have to do that and leave it freeform is because it's just for a piece of paper and a pen. There's no predefined functionality in there in terms of indexing or sorting or organizing. You're having to do it yourself, so there's an automatic implicit looseness to it. And that is something that I think the Supernote's functionality captures about paper as well, in that they give you these, even the digital enhancements, they give you these frameworks and approaches to things like perhaps headings, or perhaps tables of contents, or perhaps links, but they let you use it the way that you want to. And it's a surprisingly liberating and powerful thing.
The thing you mentioned early on was the lack of a home screen, which is controversial because everybody else kind of has one. And Supernote is like, no, we're not going to do that. If, like, I've made the case on some of my videos, if you want to use your calendar as your home screen and set your notes up so that you jump to them from a specific day, if you want to create a home note, which you've shown before and a lot of other people have shown, if you want to use the quick access, which I think is their version of a home screen, they don't say it, but to me, that's where you can get to most of your things if you want to. And that, to your, I think you put it eloquently, the flexibility and being allowed to not use a heading differently because you're like me and everything is a single note that eventually at some point gets combined into a large PDF. Now, all of those headings that are one title of one note in one folder become a large notebook that you can click through and see all of those different things later. That's how I use it. Someone who wants to use one huge master node can do it that way and then have each of those be segments within the same notebook. And it doesn't matter because the system doesn't care.
And it is, and you know, I've got a theory about the home screen thing, or the lack thereof, and why it provokes controversy. People get kind of alarmed at not being able to back out of a focus and productivity zone. You know, it has something of that feeling. You remember being in an exam hall and you've got the exam paper in front of you and you sort of look around, but you can't leave, and there's nothing else you can look at, and they've taken everything else away with you, so you just have to get on with it. And the Supernote is a wee bit like that. It's like these features on our phones these days where you can say, okay, I'm only allowed to be on Instagram for 10 minutes per day, or YouTube for 20 minutes a day or something, and it pops up a screen and says, you're done. Albeit it lets you, you know, plead for an extra 15 minutes or whatever. But they're meant to enforce productivity as a side effect of taking away means of procrastination, which is, it's not a fabulous, I mean, you're sort of not addressing the problem, but mechanically, I suppose it works. It acts like nagging. And I think that the people that perhaps get the most alarmed about the Supernote not being a home screen right in the middle, and then you jump out to apps like the reader or the note-taking app or whatever, just like a computer, just like even an iPad. I think that an element of it is this fear almost, you know, the fear of the blank canvas or the blank page in the typewriter, whereby you're confronted with the thing that you have to focus upon, and you're not allowed to get out of your chair and walk away from it and have a snack or watch the TV. I think there's something of that about it, and I think it's an intentional design for that reason.
Yeah, I agree. And you reminded me, that's one reason that, and have you ever used Obsidian or Notion or any of those? One reason
I played with Notion, but yeah, no, I know you're a much bigger Obsidian user than I. All I wanted to say is that I do have Obsidian, and I only have it for a couple of really long-running, more Zettelkasten type projects where, think of it as maybe a long-term personal research project, a couple of those that I occasionally chip away at, and they are much better suited to ready interlinking and looking at the graph of ideas and that kind of thing. So I'm familiar with it, but I don't use it anything like as extensively as I believe that you do.
I fell in love with it by accident. I ran across Nick Milo's video on, linking your thinking, which was the title of his channel, and I thought, Wow, this is interesting. Part of my education is in adult education, so cognitive mapping and, kind of that's where I started mind mapping and really getting into that years ago. But what you said just there about the Supernote kind of forcing you in some ways to stay on task, Obsidian does that in some ways, even though it's meant to be this dispersed system. But when you close Obsidian, when you reopen it, it takes you back to where you were.
Mm.
So it's not a home screen. It's always back to now you can load and go back to your main view but you set that up. So there's a lot of synergy between the two platforms, one very, very digital, one more tactile. I wanted to pull on that thread because my brain kind of works that way. And a lot of times what I'll do is I'll take my notes in the Supernote and then there's a plugin that'll pull it into Obsidian. And then as I'm editing those notes from a meeting, I think of all of the links, which is why I don't use the Supernote linking function as much as some people do, because I use Obsidian for that. So as I'm refining and revising, and I may mention 3 or 4 people, I have them as contacts, I link them right into that new note. And then
Mm.
I have my handwriting as reference. So it's like this really almost best of both worlds kind of thing, again, for me, not for everybody.
I do think it is the best. I think the research shows that that practice of being in the moment with regard to taking the notes and then soon thereafter reviewing them and creating the linkages, I think that is meant to produce the best understanding and long-term recall for learning of any kind. So I do think you have the best of both worlds.
And I think what's interesting is my old process. And again, this is e-ink agnostic, so it's device agnostic. But the old process was to take all the handwritten notes, then come back and tortuously transcribe those into OneNote. And that was just, you're spending so much time trying to move them that you're not thinking about them as you're doing it. This new workflow that I have pulls in the recognized text because Supernote allows you to do that with Obsidian. And so I at least have a starting point. So yeah, I'm dealing with some grammar and some issues and some misrecognized text, but I'm not recreating everything. And if I took 20 pages or 30 pages of notes that week, it becomes very arduous to do it the old way. I think both are valid. It's just one is a huge time commitment versus the other.
I think literally just copying your notes has it will reinforce recollection to some extent. I think it has limited value in terms of analysis and learning, and it also sort of presupposes that the notes you took in the moment when a part of your attention was still on the speaker or your last thought or whatever were the best possible notes. And of course that's probably virtually never the case. You need that digestion process. I would actually say that the occasional handwriting transcription errors when you're using those plugins to take raw Supernote files and turn them into text, up to a certain point, the more errors, the better it is, because you have to pay that much more attention and think back over what you said and reanalyze the sentences. So it creates a certain, whilst it's an annoying task, it creates a certain need for close reading, which is very conducive to that sort of reflection and rethinking process.
Yeah, I agree. And we're going off script. I mean, but we've also, believe it or not, answered a few of our questions because we talked about kind of why we picked our devices. One thing we didn't do, and I'm curious, I mean, you mentioned your wife influenced you by having the scribe and absolutely loving it. But did you, and you read the manual, but did you watch in YouTube videos? I mean, were there people that were doing the e-ink thing and before you started diving in and buying the books and then buying the Supernote, were there specific people that influenced you?
I don't honestly recall if I watched much e-ink stuff prior to the last couple of years. So by the time whenever it was that Amazon launched the first scribe, that was my explosion of interest. I had always wanted a tablet computer in the sense of a thing to write on, and I remember the tablet PCs from way back in the day, long before iPads and all that sort of thing. So by the time I was really getting involved in the e-ink space heavily, notwithstanding that passive background marketing based awareness of Remarkable, there were already Kit Masters and Jeffrey Moss and your own videos and so on. But I'm one of these people who, I'm sure like yourself, when a new interest blooms, I will happily consume weeks worth of YouTube material and articles if I can find them, although it becomes increasingly difficult these days to find written pieces on things. So I suppose I make the purchase decision long before I actually click the buy button, and then I spend weeks preemptively justifying by extensively researching the subject.
Well, and that was hard for me because the reason I bought my A5X, and I've only ever owned the Supernotes. I bought the Moby Scribe Wave to have as a universal reader, which I actually enjoy for that because I have books in both ecosystems, Kobo and Amazon. But I got a bonus for some work I did, and I knew I wanted one. I had no idea which one. So I did a huge deep dive into every piece of content Voya had. I would say that, and JB Glossinger over on Morning Coat, he talked about it and talked about using it in a professional context. Kit and Brandon Boswell and Voya, My Deep Guide, were the driving forces.
Voya, of course, yeah.
And that was before I found Jeff Moss, and of course he and Roderick at Rants About Tech and Vlad Kostek and I are really good friends, and we've become friends by doing this, of all things. I started as a hobby, and then I made really good friends out of it. But those three, Brandon, Voya, and Kit, kind of answered every question I had of which device would be right for me by watching the three of them, because they all have different takes, they all have different use cases, and they all have different thoughts and things they focus on. And I think that's what's so valuable about this space. And I try to do a balance between writing and video. I do way more video than I do writing, but I try to do some blogs and different things for that same reason, because I want people to make the right decision. These aren't cheap. They're not inexpensive device. And if you get one that you hate, it's going to sour your experience. It may not do what you want it to do. And the more information you have out front, the more likely you are to pick the right device at the beginning.
I would also say that it's obviously best to get the thing that's going to suit you best. To whatever extent you can do that without being able to try them. That's one of the issues with e-ink devices. It's almost impossible to go into a store anywhere and try them up front. It also is true that if your workflow is really focused on the liberation of a paper-like experience, then you really can make the best of just about any one of these devices. So there is a degree of flexibility, and there is a point after which the workflow and the UI design and all of that is sort of the icing on the cake. Because I've now used 3 different manufacturers' devices, and they do all have their strengths. And I think the same is true with the reviewers. I mean, Kit, I can presumptuously use, be on first name terms with someone I've never spoken to.
I don't think he
I don't think so either. He's wonderful with the comparisons and with being up to date with the latest device. Voya and Jeffrey Moss, of course, extremely in-depth. Jeffrey in particular, Mr. Moss perhaps I should say, wonderful for going right through all of the interface and every possible option. That's enormously helpful with a books device when there are millions of options. And of course Voya tests every little aspect, latency and the distance from the surface of the screen to the e-ink display and all that sort of thing. And I think that everyone has to bring their own style and their own value to these things. Despite my background, my appreciation of these things isn't technical at all. I love e-ink, I love how it looks and how it works, but I don't care about the technology. I care about the human side of it and the type of focus and the type of concentration and creativity that it facilitates. It's fair to say that you can be productive with a scrap of paper and an old pencil that you find in a drawer if you apply yourself to it. There are certainly many advantages, as we've been speaking about, to these devices, but they are a privilege, of course, not just because of the expense associated with them. And if you truly can embrace that paper type workflow, you can do it with paper and with notebooks, as you and I did for for so many years. And I suppose I would say that to people who are thinking about these devices and who are agonizing over the cost and over which manufacturer and which specific device to go for. The greatest difference between them is not specific to any one device. It's that it's not a computer. It's a paper-like experience. And I think in many ways the best way to prepare yourself for an e-ink tablet, or to determine whether you should get one, is to see if you can benefit for a few weeks just from using a paper notebook and incorporating that into your workflow or back into your workflow and get the feel of it. Because for me, it was an instant and absolutely obvious resonance that it had for me, just using pen on paper again and being free in that way. It was so obvious to me that I needed this. I needed that second surface that was physical and tactile. The greatest test of whether you should have one of these is whether you can incorporate paper into your workflow, be it physical or otherwise.
Such a good point. I think that that's what gets lost sometimes, because I've watched your videos, you've watched my videos. I don't focus on the tech specs as much. I talk about them as in, yes, the resolution's better on the Manta than it was the A5X. But the truth is, and I did a blog article that I'm going to make a video on, if you're happy with your A5X and there are no problems with it, I wouldn't recommend somebody buying a Manta. I wouldn't, and neither would Supernote, quite frankly. I think anyone, if you're happy with the device you have, if you picked it for the right reasons, like you said, if you know that paper works in your workflow and you think of this as digital paper, which sometimes gets lost in what's happening now with all of the color displays, all of the different pushes to do huge processors in these tablets and make them be more iPad-like. There's nothing wrong with the iPad. I absolutely love it, but it's not a paper replacement. It's a computer. I think to your point earlier, you have to realize, am I trying to replace the wrong tool? I guess is my way of thinking about it. Like I looked at the ink phones and I thought, oh, well, I might get the high break. And I even pressed order. I was going to get the high break. Then I realized for the same price or a little less by trading in, I can get the S25 Samsung device that does all of the things I could possibly need. And I have a notebook, which is what I would actually use e-ink for, to be able to read and write and do the things that it does very, very well. Do I need my phone to do that? And so it's hard. I think you've got to weigh into what do you want your devices to do?
Yes, it's a critical point. That's one of the most important points you could make, genuinely. The great lesson of e-ink tablets is it's that they are a separate thing from your computer and something to be used alongside. They're sort of teaching this lesson by stealth, that the supposed efficiency of unifying all your needs in a single device is almost always a false efficiency, because some things are just better with two different devices. Say a computer for a whole series of classes of work, but a piece of paper or its digital equivalent for brainstorming or whatever. I think there is this unspoken false assumption, or perhaps more generously oversimplification, that says that the more things you can do on a single machine or with a single tool, the more productive you'll be. And that, in my experience, is virtually always false. Your tool set might become more portable, or you might need less space for it or something, but you are basically compounding compromise upon compromise upon compromise, almost like a 3 axes of compromise, until you end up with this single thing, or very small number of things that can do the majority of what you want, only to a moderate extent. Whereas if you are willing to accept that using multiple tools allows you to have specialized tools, quite often that is the thing that shakes everything loose and makes you realize that using something that is explicitly designed for a given task invariably allows you to do the task better.
Yeah, I agree. And it's what brought this up in my mind, and I don't know if you've seen, I'm testing out the terminal. This is an e-ink panel that just updates you.
You mentioned it. Yeah, I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
I bring it up not because this, which I do think is a fabulous thing, whether it's worth the money or not, I just opened it up. But I love the concept. The concept is that it sits on your desk, it's low power, it'll last for months and months and months on a charge, and that you can customize the widgets in the display to show you different things at different times. Pretty cool. Why I bring it up though is exactly your case and mine that we just made about the right tool for the right job, because they're web app and they don't tell you when you get the thing. They give you a QR code. They give you no documentation, just a QR code, one piece of paper with that. And so you open their web app and you think, okay, this should be mobile friendly. I should be able to set my terminal. You can. You just can't. I show it in the video. You just can't. Go to a desktop computer, it's much more user friendly. It's much easier to interface with. Not everything can be done on your phone. Not everything needs to be done on your desktop computer. Not everything needs to be done on your email. And I think that's kind of at the heart of this. That's to our question, which we had and you brilliantly circled around to, which is what would you tell somebody starting out? I think that's one of the biggest things is, do you A, need this? Or is it just a want? And if it's a want, that's fine. If it's just something you want to do. But if you need it, what do you need it to do and why? And I think
Mm.
those are the biggest questions you have to ask yourself before you go and purchase a device that could frustrate you
I
otherwise.
think so. I mean, one of my hobbies is music. If you want to, I mean, I'm classically trained piano player, and if you want to lay down a keyboard track in Logic or whatever, it will happily give you a lovely on-screen keyboard, and you can click it with your mouse, or you can use a typing keyboard where some of the notes are mapped to the alphanumeric keys, and you can do it that way. But using a piano keyboard or a MIDI controller with keys on it is so much easier and so much more flexible and creative and relaxing, because we've been using fundamentally the same instrument for I don't even know how many years. If you want to get serious about your camera setup for your YouTube videos, you can use the webcam that's part of the top lid of your laptop, or you can get something that'll let you, adjust your white balance and put a nice lens on it and all that kind of thing. And these are luxuries and they're expenditures and so on. But if it's something that you're either passionate about or is going to enhance your productivity or allow you to do something you couldn't previously do that you need to do or want to do, as you say, then by and large, dedicated tools are better because they have been created by people who have thought about the domain of that particular tool can be made into its best form, not just how it can be made to sit alongside a cluster of other things that must all have their own competing compromise. I've got a woodworking workshop outside, and I wouldn't like to even estimate or tell you, or have you tell my wife how many extremely specific tools I have out there for incredibly niche cases, which I virtually never encounter. But my goodness, having that specific, beautifully designed tool not just facilitates the task, but makes it a pleasure. I think, as you so rightly say, that is one of the lessons of these devices. It's the old right tool for the job thing.
And I love the woodworking analogy. My father-in-law, Melissa's dad, has a wood shop built into his garage, and everything's on casters, so you can move it out of the way. But one of my favorite things when we first got married, and we don't get to do it as much anymore, but we used to go down there and make, writing pens. And so we get the lathe out, and go and make the pen. And I find it so relaxing. But again, it's a different tool, and the size of lathe matters, and the size of the wood you're working with, and all of the precision. And I think that you're not going to use a bandsaw for everything. You're not going to use, you're not going to use a bandsaw when you need a lathe. I think we can definitely agree that, that may be an old phrase, but it's an old phrase for a reason. Tools matter,
Indeed.
and the toolkit matters. So no, that's great. I do want to ask you a question, and I think I may know the answer to this, but since you've made this switch to e-ink and the way you're doing your workflow now, do you feel that it actually makes you more creative or just more organized? I'm kind of curious because I've seen you walk through on your videos your creative process, But I'm wondering,
Hmm.
is that really the device, or is that kind of that's just the way you think and this facilitates that? I'm curious.
I would hate to think that my creativity is device dependent, particularly when you're a writer, of course, because some charcoal and a cave wall were more than enough for artists, and parchment and paper and quills and pens and so on have been fine for people doing what I do for a very long time. So I think creativity is a function of the person and their application, the will that they apply to doing the thing. So I wouldn't want anyone to think that there's some artificial gate on creativity just because you don't own such and such a device or tool. I wouldn't say that. And I also would have to say I don't feel more organized because of these devices, because they are not tools of organization for me. They are places to explore and to plan and to think. So what the Supernote in particular and the e-ink workflow in general gives me is it's that focus, is the feeling of a complete lack of a barrier between what I am thinking and what I can put down. I think it's actually even the permission for imperfection that comes from working on paper or a paper-like surface. There's no expectation of finality, and I think there is just a wee element of an implicit concreteness that comes from, say, typing ideas in this sort of structured and strictured form into text on a computer screen that just isn't there on paper, because paper, in which I include e-ink, is a place of exploration and of sketching and of incidental jotting and crossing things out and moving things about and crumpling up and throwing in the bin beside the desk and all that wonderful stuff that lets you just feel set free from expectation and from tempo and from the four walls of the computer screen around you. For some reason, the top and bottom and left and right edges of a piece of paper or an e-ink tablet, they don't have that same boundary quality that backlit displays do, that sort of emotional subtext of containment and restrict. I think the magic of working on paper, again including e-ink, is that not only does it sort of forcibly focus you, especially the Supernote, on the thing you're doing, but maybe paradoxically, it also makes you feel that there are no pre-imposed limitations on the kind of work and the kind of thinking you can do. And I think it is that implicit lack of expectation or demand that makes it such a powerful medium of focus for me. And of course, that naturally has a huge boosting effect on creativity.
And that's interesting because this is where I think that this conversation is really important, because you and I would say it doesn't always make me more creative, but there are times, because I'm doing something in a different way than I may have done it in the past, that I'll try something, or that I'll,
Mm.
move outside, or experiment, or I may not do that in another medium. And I don't think it's device specific. I 100% agree with you there. I think it's just more environmental. It's more, I'm in a different headspace. I'm thinking about something different. And as I'm doing that, there's a different tool set available to me depending on which device or which thing that I'm engaged with at the moment. Because what's crazy about this, and I think is you really put it well, for me, I'm very structured. I mean, my channel, people know this about me. I mean, I do naming conventions for my folder structure. I do all of these things to really kind of hone down and get a structure underneath. So my Obsidian vault, for example, is very, very structured, but that's the base. So tomorrow, if Obsidian was gone and I needed to access all of my files, they're all redundant and they're all there. The connections
Mm.
are the creative part. They're the part that's trying to map my brain and connect this person that may be in 7 folders down over here with this meeting that happened in this totally different section, or this personal event that's in another part of my vault. And I think that's the beauty of something like this, is that you can be highly organized, but then you can also think, okay, how can I maximize this tool or this medium more so than the tool, to start making connections and thinking about things differently and forming relationships in a way, in your own, the way your mind does, with events, pieces, and items. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's, so it's like this subtext is like the base layer, like your, your automated functions that your brain does. But then all of a sudden you have all of these other ways of being and ways of communicating and ways of doing things that these types of devices and types of software programs, in the case of PC, things like Obsidian and Notion and Evernote, to really kind of get free from, it's under folder A, subfolder B, subfolder C, more along the lines of, wait a minute, all of those things have relationships that aren't readily visible. Does that make sense at all? But that's kind
It
of,
does, yeah. I think you're talking about what I think of as the two-stage nature of any sort of deep work, whereby there's the right up at the face of it, creative process, the generation, and then after that there is the making sense of, the connection forming, perhaps in your case, the filing, the organic cross-linking, the spawning of consequential ideas that happens usually after, and maybe sometimes subconsciously after that process of intense sort of right up in front of it, blank page creativity. And I think that the multivalent nature of paper and its digital versions has always lent itself to that. I mean, in the last 48 hours, I've used the Manta for sketching out a plan and diagramming for a woodworking project, which is one, for working on the jacket promo blurb, back cover of a novel, which is another kind of work, to messing with lyrics for a song that my brother and I are working on, which again is a very different kind of work. But you can do all of these things when there are not the preconceived constraints on the format or type of creativity, and then you take them to maybe a 3D modeling app to create a proper plan for the woodworking, or you take the lyrics to maybe a word processor or something else, or into your music production software to try and put together the structure, or the book, you take it into maybe a word processor or novel writing software in order to play with it and tweak it, maybe even graphic software to lay it onto a book back cover and see how it works. So you've got this two-stage process of wanting to be free and not too soon forced into a particular funnel or a particular shape, which e-ink is fantastic for. And then the connectivity, the sync, the connection, the readability of the file format via the plugin into Obsidian, whatever it might be, that allows you to progress to this second step, the structuralizing and all that sort of thing, which would of course be mechanically a bit more difficult if you were working literally on physical paper.
So there are times I come at it both ways. So like you just said, there are times, like I laid out before, where I'm very structured out front and then I do the connections. But there are also times when it's messy and then I come back and add in the structure later. So I think that the flexibility to be able to switch between those two things, depending on the project and depending on what you're trying to do, I think is really important. So that's really good. Just out of curiosity, we just got a couple more questions, and then I want to be mindful of time here. But I think we've hit a lot of these. But I'm curious. I mean, I've mentioned the fact that I use Obsidian quite a bit. What other softwares, like, do you have some go-to softwares that you use to help keep yourself either organized or be more creative? You kind of alluded to some authoring software or image software that you might use, something like that.
Yeah, I've previously, I'm Scottish, and my people have this Calvinist streak of minimalism, whereby I think we try to love as few things as possible, lest they be taken away later, to be honest. And I've been quite guilty of that, trying to use the stock apps that come with the operating system rather than becoming involved with a fancier email client or whatever it might be. And I think that's bled into other areas of my work. So I try to use as few tools as possible, but I try not to compromise on which tools those are, if you know what I mean. So I did previously flirt with timeline software, say, which can be very good for planning out a complex novel with a whole set of different events that happen at different points in time in different places. But it was too structured, and I preferred to just do it in a simpler way, sketch out something on paper or on the tablet and go from there. I did use MindNode, which I mentioned previously, it's a mind mapping app, but it does also have a outliner interface to the same data, which is fascinating. And I used it a bit, but again, I found that I felt it was maybe pushing me too quickly towards a sense of finality on my outlines or such. So really, the specialist software I use for music production, Logic, I don't have a particular modelling application. I do tend to just sketch things out for woodworking, etc. Davinci for YouTube, and for writing it's Ulysses. And the great advantage there is that it's cross-platform in the Apple sense. So Mac, iPad, iPhone, I can always make little tweaks or edits or annotations or such wherever I happen to be. I think that software can be every bit as much of a rabbit hole is the term, isn't it, as e-ink tablets or nice cameras for YouTube or whatever it might be. You can spend any amount of time and any amount of money going as deep as you like, but I think ultimately you have to get to the point where you pull the trigger and make a decision, because selectiveness and seeking the perfect solution becomes a form of procrastination, and it becomes something that detracts from getting things done. With writing novels, in terms of the raw writing and editing, you can use just about anything, and people have been using just Microsoft Word or whatever, and Notepad on Windows if they still have Notepad, for years and years and years, and you absolutely can do that. I think the key is to get started, do the work, and then figure out where the friction is and address that. Start simple. Use a piece of paper instead of an expensive e-ink tablet. Use a simple word processor instead of fancy custom novel writing software. Use the free video editing tools instead of the studio version of Davinci for your YouTube stuff, and find where those edges we spoke about earlier, the points of friction, the points of lacking, find where they are organically by actually doing the thing. And by the time you get to the point where you've identified something you actually do need, not only will it be a more informed decision, but you will also have done a whole lot of work already rather than just watching hundreds of YouTube videos.
I couldn't agree more. And right now we're recording this using OBS, which is an open source. I'm a huge open source platform supporter. The same way with educational tools, anything that is open educational resources, open source products, I'm a huge supporter of. Of course, Obsidian is, but I pay for their publish service and I pay for their sync service, which helps support them at a lower cost and also is of a huge benefit to me. Funny enough, Davinci Resolve I use as well. I did pay for the studio version because when I put that up against other product, it was a perpetual license versus a subscription.
Yeah, it's also about saving time. With there's so many features in Resolve Studio, which I have as well, that obviate hours and hours of work sometimes if you're masking something or animating something or whatever. So I think obviously being able to do something like buy a $300+ version of a piece of software that you can get most of for free is a privilege, and every bit as much as it is a privilege to buy an expensive e-ink tablet. But I think what people sometimes forget to do is to consider not just immediate financial costs, but also the cost of one's time over the future. And I think actually if I may, that brings us back to a point you touched on earlier, and I meant to expand upon, but it slipped my mind, that the cost of a Supernote it's sort of unique in that the company wants you to have the thing for years and years and years, and they will not release another one on this annual drumbeat for the sake of investors and value and all that sort of thing. So you are comparing apples to oranges in a way, because with other manufacturers, the cost of it is the cost for perhaps a year or two, whereas with the Supernote and with certain other products from other companies, I'm sure that your viewers can come up with examples. That cost is amortized over a much longer period because its useful life is so much longer. And this is particularly true for e-ink tablets, isn't it? Because they really, with your A5X, they just don't degrade in the same way, and they retain that usefulness, and they have that longevity that just isn't there with other devices, particularly computers.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that gets to kind of the heart of why, I mean, you mentioned Rada, now that they've gone with the Supernote to being fully modular and they've launched all those DIY kits. But to be perfectly fair, my A5X has shown no battery degradation, and it's coming up on being 4 years old. It still works with the newest version of the software. So that's why it's very hard for me to say to somebody, if you're happy with it and it works, to buy it just to buy it. I would wait until it was a need. But to your point about like Resolve and stuff, and the cost benefit of what you have as far as time versus commitment. I was finding that I was wasting so much time editing certain things, and there was a function in the studio version of Resolve that gave me back, to your point, hours of time. That made sense to do that, and by that point, my little side hobby YouTube thing was making enough money, not much, but enough that it could pay for a little bit of something here or there to reinvest in the hobby. And that's kind of my baseline. Those who followed me for a long time know I don't go out and buy. I don't have a Sony ZV-1. It's great for the people who do, and I don't have a $2,000 DSLR camera. I have decent equipment, but I have the equipment I need for what I want to do. And I think that's kind of back to our whole point there of being intentional is really important. I am mindful of time, but I do have one more question, and I want you and I to kind of tackle this. The question for you is, because you did this shift from being in IT, and like you said, you had experience writing when you were younger, but for somebody who's just starting out, for somebody who thinks, you know what, I have a story to tell, or I have something that I want to say, but I really don't know where to start. What would your advice be? How would you approach that, or have them approach jumping into that space?
Well, as I have grown a wee bit older, I'm 45, and like you, I'm a father of boys, one in my case. And what I've learned in my life is that there are always a great many people ready to give advice. And I say that as someone who is literally just about to do that very thing. That advice has never been more accessible than today, with a million articles and a billion videos and so on. And I think we have to go back to what you and I spoke about a wee bit earlier, where the thinking can become a barrier to the doing. So my advice for someone, as you ask, who wants to start writing fiction, would be the same advice that I would give to someone who wanted to start producing music, or that I'm sure you would give to someone who wanted to start YouTubing or whatever it might be. And it is that it's far more important to start than to set all of the parameters for how you might ideally want to start. The way to start writing is, you might have thought I was going to say, come up with getting a good idea of its story structure, buy a book on that, and learn about the 3-act structure and the inciting event, and about the time of reaction, the time of action, and all that stuff. I wouldn't say that at all. What I would say is to do what I did when I was 12, and to just get started and feel your way. because as I hope you would say, as someone involved in education, to do a thing is one of the greatest ways to learn how to do a thing. You will not do it optimally, but you will learn so much better. No one does it optimally immediately, but the optimal way to start learning is just to start doing. I wouldn't perhaps take that entirely to power tools for woodworking. In that case, yes, do definitely read the manual and watch the safety videos first. There has to be a certain element of pragmatism, but for something as completely physically safe as writing or making music or making videos or whatever it is, any creative endeavour, learning to draw, learning to sing, the most important thing is not to overthink it, to not be paralysed by that blank white page or that blank very light grey e-ink display, and to start actually doing the thing. By all means seek advice, and by all means seek to understand the field and to learn things. That's useful and it's fun, but it also is one of the many masks of procrastination and of fear. And I think it's a great tragedy if ultimately we spend more time thinking about a thing than doing the thing. I think the great lesson of life is to start.
All of these different methodologies, you have all of these different ways that people will tell you to get organized or to do the thing. But that doesn't work for everybody. You have to determine as an individual what you're comfortable with, how your mind processes information. And I like that you brought up and kind of called me on the carpet a little bit about education, because I think experimentation is a huge advantage. Not being afraid to fail, creating opportunities to where you feel safe failing a lot. Do the thing in a low stakes environment. Start with organizing your own personal files before you take it to a whole system of for your work life. Start playing around like I did with the side hobby of YouTube. I started doing that structure. Don't be afraid. I mean, I did a video here a while back on the very first video I made, which was awful. It was absolutely awful. It was just me and a little camera and the microphone from my laptop. But you know what? I did it. And I learned as I went that I don't have to spend a fortune. And I watched people who told me. I gravitated. I mean, don't get me wrong. Kit brought me on and we talked to early on when I started doing this as a hobby. But I watch him because he reviews things that are both the high-end camera and the really interesting budget mini PC, because he understands, and hopefully, in some ways I understand, that everyone's at a different place. And it's kind of what you just said of start where you're at. Don't be afraid. Don't create artificial barriers. Don't put up, oh, well, I don't understand organization, so I'm going to read Atomic Habits. And I mean, I'm not a huge Atomic Habits fan. I've read it, but it doesn't fit with the way I think. And I think it is a very good book for people who think that way and need that kind of structure. I'm a little bit more scattershot. So it doesn't work as well for me. I know that about myself. So I gravitate to people who are like or doing things that can enhance the way I already think. To your point, yeah, we asked to give advice. I wanted to hear your take. And I quite frankly wasn't sure how you would do it because I saw your description of how you did changer and how you jump off from different points and all of that. But I think that central argument of just start doing something is so important for any of these.
I think I loved your phrase there about creating or finding an environment which makes potential failure a thing of safety. A low stakes environment for failure. That it's not only the best advice I think that someone can be given for any creative endeavour or other endeavour. It's also, of course, the great attraction of paper-like devices that they have that blank page that can take on any form. It can be a table, it can be a drawing, it can be a mind map, it can be prose, it can be poetry, lyrics, whatever it might be. And you can always score something out or, in the digital forms, erase and rewrite and move it around. That's the beauty of this physical, tactile workflow. I think that you've so wisely touched upon, that it creates, with its infinite possibility, also is a place where there are no consequences.
Matt, thank you so much. We stayed on longer than I thought we would, but I think it was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed getting to know you more. I enjoyed one thing just in closing here, that if anyone's watching this and you haven't watched Matt's content, all of that information will be below. Also, from a father to a father, one thing that I think has been really, and I've heard you say it in multiple videos, this idea of a daily journal to your son, I just think is amazing that you're doing that. I think that's just a really interesting personal journey. And I think those things kind of weave through why I was drawn to your channel. So getting to know you through the process, getting to know the way you approach these things has been really valuable. And I think it'll be valuable to everybody watching. But thank you so
It's been
much
an
for your
absolute
time.
pleasure for me. Oh no, it's thank you so much. This has been an absolute joy. I could sit and talk with you about these things all day long, and I'm sure we'll do another. I'm very grateful indeed.
Well, everyone, thank you so much. Please like, subscribe, all of the usual things. Also, check out and subscribe to Matt's channel, and we will see you soon.